right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Inside Writing. Today, we'll be covering the magical worlds of science fiction and fantasy. But before we get started, a little bit of our usual housekeeping. At any point in the show, and I see some of you have already done this, you can submit your questions for the Q&A portion later on in the show. There's a Q&A button on your Zoom dashboard. You can submit your questions there, and later on in the show, I will pick some to pose to our panelists. Also, stay tuned at the end of the show for instructions on how to participate in our science fiction and fantasy Twitter pitch party. So, on to our quote of the day. This one comes from Octavia Butler, who said, "I was attracted to science fiction because it was so wide open. I was able to do anything, and there were no walls to hem you in, and there was no human condition that you were stopped from examining." We'll be revisiting that quote later on in the show. But now let's meet our panelists. Firstly, literary agent at Howard Moorheim, DongWon Song. Hello, DongWon.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Excited to be here.
Yes, second panelist is the author of the book Elysium and the forthcoming title Destroyer of Light, Jennifer Marie Brissett. Hi, Jennifer.
Hey.
There she
Hi.
is. Hello. Thank you for being here with us today. So we're going to start the show the way we normally do with a definition. It's a simple definition. And since we're technically covering two genres today, we're going to do a dual definition here. So DongWon, I want to start with you. How would you define fantasy, specifically fantasy as a genre?
Oh boy, starting with an easy question, huh? Fantasy for me is always about the supernatural, right? It's having some kind of supernatural component to there, whether that's in historical setting or contemporary setting. I think it covers like a very wide range of things, right? Fantasy, to me, is a pretty broad bucket. That said, horror, I think, is distinct from fantasy. There's like a little bit of crossover in terms of, is the Dark Tower series fantasy or is it horror? Who knows, right? At some point you end up splitting hairs. So I think it's both a tonal thing. It has generally more of an adventure kind of vibe, generally more of a hero's journey kind of vibe, but that is specific to a certain subset of fantasy. So anyways, supernatural element, not too dark, I guess is how I would say it.
All right. And Jen, to you, what would you define science fiction as?
Oh boy. Well, I was where there's some kind of scientific principle, whether real or imagined, at the core of the story. That if that scientific principle or whatever it is that you're building it, even if it's quote unquote, it's actually somewhat magical because you can't forget the fiction part of the science fiction. If it needs to be at the core of the story and hold it together, that if you removed it, the story would fall apart. And I know that's kind of that's my definition.
No, I think that's good. Yeah. Curious, DongWon, to follow up on the definitions thing, science fiction and fantasy are so often connected. Even on Publishers Marketplace, they are inseparable. Why are they so joined together when there aren't? I mean, there are similarities between the two, but they aren't synonymous with each other.
The glib answer is Star Wars, right? They're really connected in these ways of having these different supernatural elements. And, there's the famous Arthur C. Clarke quote about technology and magic at some level being indistinguishable from each other, at least in how they operate in these stories. I think the thing that really divides fantasy from science fiction is the way they interrogate the questions at the core of the text, right? So science fiction to me is always about building a model, right? It's always about asking a question and proposing an answer and seeing the consequence of that answer, right? Whereas fantasy to me is almost always backwards looking. And, I don't mean that as it's a retrograde genre. It's just looking at the consequences of things that were chosen before, right? Fantasy is about traumas. Science fiction is about proposals in certain ways, right? So if you look at like Lord of the Rings, I know this is a very broad categorization. I think there's a ton of ways you can point at differences in certain areas and say, oh, this one does that, this one does that. But in a lot of ways, I think, I'm thinking of like Lord of the Rings. And the thing that we don't talk enough about in Lord of the Rings is just how sad that series is, right? That the dominant theme and mode is this sort of melancholic sadness. And I think that exists in a lot of fantasy, even in the very adventure-y ones, where so often it's about like fixing a world that is broken for some reason. and engaging with that in some way.
So I want to quickly follow up with that, because there, there's fantasy, there's light fantasy, heavy fantasy, epic fantasy. How do you draw the distinction between them, DongWon?
Well, the business answer to that question is epic fantasy sells a lot better than other kinds of fantasy. So if you can call it epic fantasy, you do that. And basically anything that's sort of more of a historical vibe, and definitely anything that is like a journey or a quest or a hero's narrative, kind of drops into that epic fantasy space. Anything that's more contemporary in terms of setting and tone obviously doesn't fall into that. In terms of like what's adventure fantasy versus epic fantasy, we could sit here all day and sort of debate the differences between those things. But for me, really, it's about contemporary or surrealist versus epic and historical.
And Jen, from the sci-fi science fiction perspective, what are some of the key subgenres that stand out for you?
Key subgenre. I'm going to say something a little bit different here. The differences between these genres is really much more fluid than marketing terms tend to allow. As a writer, you can play with a lot of these different subgenres to help enhance your stories, but you don't have to stick with one. I mean, years ago, steampunk was a really big thing, but then it sort of drifted away, and that's fine if today you still want to pull in some elements from steampunk into your work. But really, what it is when you're writing a story, you have to think about what it is that you have to say, and then maybe take elements from various different subgenres to help you to enhance that story to make it. It's not really a matter of just picking well, I guess there are people who do that. They say, I'm going to write in this subgenre and this subgenre. But I find that to be actually a little bit dangerous, because subgenres come in and out of fashion. What's really will keep your story alive is the story, what it is that you have to say. Then you think about how you want to say it and try to say it as well as you can. Hopefully that makes sense for everybody.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me following on to that just real quick, like I think part of the reason the genre conversation gets so fraught and confusing is there's really three different ways we talk about genre, right? One is what I was just doing when I answered the epic fantasy question, which is bookstore categories and marketing, right? How does publishing put a story into a box so we can package it and sell it, right? Like, it's how do we take this really unique flower and put it into an industrial system designed to sell things to consumers? And that's one way of looking at genre, right? Where does it go in the bookstore? The other way is from critical analysis, right? And this is sort of the academic approach. And that was sort of when I answered the question very broadly about like science fiction is about this and fantasy is about that. And I think that's stepping back and doing a lot of deep analysis. From a crafts perspective, though, Jen, I think is 100% correct here, where write the story you want to write, and then genre in that way almost becomes set dressing, right? What are the elements you're adding that give you the metaphors you want to tell the story that you're trying to tell here? So, it's not necessarily about writing steampunk. And I've long said steampunk isn't really a genre because it's just set dressing, right? It's just, are there gears or are there crystals? I mean, that's a really reductive, unfair way to put it. But like, I think sometimes writers on a craft level get too obsessed with what genre am I in, what subgenre I am in, and it helps us step back from that, as Jen was saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the answers you both gave was much better than the question. So thank you for going beyond what the question had.
It's a really important, interesting question. So,
DongWon, I want to. This may be another dumb question, but just so that we get it out there, how much of science fiction is science? How much of an element of science and technology does there need to be?
Very little, in my opinion. I mean, there's hard SF, which is a very specific subgenre that is very preoccupied with, the mechanics of the science and how that works. And when hard SF is done really well, again, they use the structures of science as metaphors for what's happening in the rest of the story. When it's done poorly, it's like reading an academic paper about physics. So, I think the science itself is only important so far as it furthers the central point of the story, whether that's the plot, whether that's character. The science in a story, like the magic in a story, should operate as a metaphor a very subtle one that's integrated throughout the entirety of the text, ideally. But also there's a million different ways to do this.
So Jen, I want to turn that around to you because your book Elysium has a computer tech element to it. How much research did you put into it? Are you a tech savvy person, or was that something that you put a lot of research
I was a
into?
software engineer for several years, and I still code still. One of my problems when I was in college was that I was, because I studied electrical engineering, was that I was thinking about things a little bit too deeply and seeing the metaphors and how circuits and circuitry elements work and all that, like resistors, oh, resistance, you know, my mind is going in these different directions. So science fiction has been finally a means for me to use what's been going on in my head all these years to finally be able to do something with it that's that's more artistic and more expressive. So yeah, that's the answer. But yeah, I'm a tech person. I'm an old-fashioned, blurred black nerd, and I have been all my life. So that's where I am.
Gotcha. DongWon, turning that around to you, how important is it for a book, particularly a sci-fi book, to be well researched? Can it exist on imagination alone, or does there need to be a research element to it?
I mean, frankly, I couldn't care less if the science, I mean, like, if it's like blatantly wrong, right? Like if people are, I don't know. I feel like every now and again, there's some very specific thing. Like if there's sound in space, that's the thing that bothers me, which is a dumb thing that bothers me, but it does. So if there's some like basic rules of the genre that you're violating, then I'm going to need some kind of basis for why that's happening. But in general, I mean, hand wavium is a really powerful thing. Like, you know, there's a lot of ways to get around those things or just make up some tech jargon, I think, to make something work, right? That said, it can be really exciting when something is really accurate in terms of, you know, like I was thinking of like Mr. Robot, for example, has really good hacking technology in it, represented in a way that really changed how that show works and made it really interesting, because I was like, oh, from my understanding, this is more like what coding actually is. This is more like what hacking actually is, versus, you know, bless the 90s hackers movie, which I adore, but, you know, which is a very unscientific representation of how that works. So, but I love both those things, right? For those reasons.
And Jen, specifically with Elysium, I mean, for science fiction in general, you do kind of have to look into the future. So how do you approach doing that? Like, was Elysium a future that you envisioned happening? Was it a cautionary tale, or was it just a story you wanted to tell?
Well, Elysium, so you have to remember, Elysium is like 5 years old for me now, and I've had my head in like 2 other books since then. Elysium was a lot of things. Yes, there was an element of looking into the future in that I invented this technology of the sky being able to be turned into a computer. Okay, fine. And that's kind of crazy. How's that supposed to work? You know, the atmosphere, how do you make those connections? Blah, blah, blah. I just hand waved and said that it works. Okay. But really, as I worked on the book, I found that I was really channeling a lot of not just the future, but the past. And I mean, there's the theme of Hadrian and Antinous, so you definitely got the past working in that story for that. But when I'm talking about the dust that flows, that comes down and it poisons the air, I mean, I realized as I was writing, what I was really channeling was 9/11 and how that dust was covering everything, and how it covered people I knew, and it was poison, and it so I started to really channel the city at that time, the New York City. And if you look in the book underneath, some people may notice it and some people may not notice it, but a lot of elements of New York City show up. The Museum of Fine Arts shows up. I mean, the Metropolitan Museum of Art shows up. Bethesda Fountain shows up. The Cloisters shows up. So in other words, what I did with that book was I channeled past, present, and future, which is somewhat a little bit of what Afrofuturism, if you're going to put me in that category, is about playing with time and using the past to inform the future. Sankofa and all of that kind of stuff. So that's not exactly what I was thinking, but when I was finished, I realized that's what I had done.
Mm-hmm.
So long answer for a very simple question.
That was a great answer. That was perfect. DongWon, I feel like there are some science fiction elements that tend to have a lot of representation in the market, like portal stories, even saying dystopias. There are a lot of dystopias out there. Will there always be a market for this kind of thing, or is there ever a certain theme or trend that will oversaturate?
I mean, things come and go, right? Like 10 years ago, we were seeing a ton of military SF, and we just don't see a lot of that right now, right? There's a lot less of that sort of very pro-imperialistic kind of fiction out there. You know, I think as the conversation shifts in the general pop culture about, you know, warfare and colonialism and those kind of things, I think that has had a real impact on what the readership is looking for and what publishers are interested in. You know, that said, I think a very Star Wars style space adventure fantasy is always going to be popular. You know, space opera is just one of these evergreen genres that it's always fun to see a bunch of people on a spaceship go off and try to do something difficult, right? You know, grand adventure and sort of epic scope are things that are always appealing. And you can do that in space opera in a way that's hard to do in almost any other genre. And, you know, I think near future science fiction, sort of technology-driven science fiction, you know, is always, again, a thing that is a very broad category, but we're always going to see Jurassic Parks. We're always going to see neuromancers and those kind of things that I think are very appealing in that sort of 5 second in the future. What's the world going to look like tomorrow? What are the interesting questions about the world today that we can examine using that lens?
Mm-hmm. And Jen, I'm curious, with science fiction, how do you make futuristic technology accessible to a reader? Like, how do you make what you're creating feel real to them?
Well, I mean, by the time you're at that level, you're really dealing with the details. You're really trying to make things feel tangible. And, you know, use I call them the 7 senses. You know, the 5 senses, the 5 base senses of touch, taste, sight, hearing. What's the other one? Taste.
Taste.
I can't remember. I lost track of which ones I just said. But the 5 basic senses, and then there's 2 other senses, which I usually teach in my class. I don't need to teach it here. But for a technology piece, you want to, you know, how does that thing physically feel in your hand? Is it cold? Is it smooth? Is it rough? What are the colors of it? What is the shape of it? What is the texture of it? You know, when it does the thing that it does, how does it feel for that thing to do what it does? You know, do you smell something? Does it make things burn? So you can smell the smoke. Does it make things cold so that it has a different feeling to it? You know, try to use your senses, at least 3 different senses in a scene, to help to make that scene come alive. That's generally my methodology.
I like that. So I want to move on to talking about this concept in science fiction of the big idea of any given book. For example, Feed by Mira Grant deals with zombies. There's a ton of zombie stories out there, but her kind of big idea revolved around this zombie infested world that was still connected through social media. So Jen, do you have a big idea in mind when you're writing a book, or do you feel like this term is just sort of too broad to approach?
Oh, that's a pretty broad term. And to say big idea, I'm not sure I really think of my writing in that way. I really kind of think about what is the heart and the story, or what I call the golden thread of the story. And sometimes you have an idea, a base idea, but you don't know how the story is going to come about. So you just have to sort of keep writing. I mean, I'm in that process right now because I'm working on my 3rd book. And you just kind of keep writing the idea. And then as you're looking, you can start to feel what is happening here. What is the magic, for lack of a better way of saying it, that's holding the story together, and really try to enhance that. So it's not really necessarily like, I've got a big idea, I'm going to slam it onto the page. It's more also a sense of discovery, because if you're discovering, chances are your reader is discovering with you. And that's part of the enjoyment of of getting into the book, you don't necessarily need to know the very end or how things are going to work out. You sort of work your way through it. And then when the magic starts to happen, when you start to feel it starting to work, then you're like, oh, wow. You're feeling that wow, and your reader is feeling that wow too. So that's how my approach to it.
DongWon, do you have anything to add about this concept of a big idea?
I think a lot of what Jen is saying is like really on point there. I think for most writers, you start writing and you sort of unpack as you go, or maybe don't even figure out what your book was really about until years after the fact. I work with some writers who set out with a mission in mind of like, I want to write a book about this topic, or I want to write a thing about this. But then it's important to sort of put that in a box or put it in the back burner in some way, so that you're not writing a polemic, right? There was some great quote from Shirley Jackson that sort of got to this point, and I've forgotten it already. I need to go look it up again. But, a thing I always think about is, if you could just simply state what the idea of your book is, then you should write an essay instead. If you want to write a novel, then the thing that you're interrogating should be complex enough, and the answers you're proposing should be nuanced enough that they resist simple articulation, right? That's why you're writing a book, to think about these things and to examine these things. But you're processing really complex issues through narrative, right? And you're telling a satisfying story. But behind that, there always is a thing. There's always a big idea. There's always a big question. Whether you're aware of that or deliberately creating that or not is a really different question about craft and your style and how your brain works.
Mm.
So Jen, I want to revisit the quote from Octavia Butler where she said, "You can do anything in science fiction." First off, do you agree with that? And if so, is it ever intimidating to write with so few boundaries?
Well, I think that's true for any kind of fiction that you write. You can do anything. You can go through walls with your writing. It's not film where you're hampered by all lights and cameras and a budget. It's just you and the piece of paper. So you can really basically do anything. And yes, it is intimidating. A blank page is a very scary thing. So as much prep as you can do to sort of get yourself in the zone, that's really great. But of course it's intimidating. It's part of the, one of the things that makes writing so difficult is just sitting there and trying and trusting yourself, and trusting that what you have to say is worthy of hearing. And sometimes that's very, very, very scary. But that's where confidence comes in, and confidence takes time, and it takes and work. The more you work, the more confident you get. The more confident you get, the more you work. So sometimes you just sort of, when I first started out, I used to use the term "fake it till you make it." So you just pretend that you're the writer that you want to be, and you look at that blank page and say, well, the writer I want to be looks at this page and writes this, and just begin, and just, even though you're afraid, be courageous and just write anyway, and try not to worry about it too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, talk about publishing or success in publishing requires holding two very opposing ideas in your head at all times, right? And it's about like learning to believe two things at once. And with regard to that, you need to have the self-confidence and the borderline arrogance to say, yes, you should read my work. You should read my words. My ideas are good and they're worth sharing, and you should spend hours of your time, $20 or whatever it is, to engage with this. But also to have the humility to recognize that you always need to be working on your craft, and you need to listen to feedback from others. And it's both knowing that you're amazing and incredible and everyone should be paying attention to you, and also you got work to do and you need to listen to other people and grow as a writer. And I think the more you can hold both those things in your head at the same time, the more likely you are to succeed, in my opinion.
I'm completely agreeing with that. I'm like sitting here going, yes, say that. That's true.
So Jen, I'm curious, with so little hemming you in, how does a story start for you? Do you start with a character, a scene, an idea? Where do your stories normally begin?
Well, every novel is different. Every story is different. So sometimes it's just an idea that's just been floating in my head, like it came from a dream or something. Or I saw something on the street or on the train, or a newspaper article, a magazine article, something. Ideas come from all over the place, and I tend to have bookmarks, and I have this program that's called Pocket. So if I see an article or something, I just sort of drop it into the Pocket and save it, and I, tag it, like tag it, say research or something. And if I'm looking for ideas, or I'll just look in there and oh, I remember this story. This gave me an idea. And so ideas come from all over the place, and starting a story is sometimes, as this just happened to me actually this weekend. I've been working on the beginning of this novel. I'm just like 27,000 words into it, and I realized that the first chapter of this book I had written, like, it was the 16th chapter. So I had to move that 16th chapter all the way to the very beginning. And I kind of feel like the book started to click at that moment. But had I not written to get to that chapter, I wouldn't have seen, oh, wait a minute, this is actually the beginning. So you don't necessarily, where you start is not necessarily where you end up starting. You might find it someplace else. And that's kind of cool when that happens. So it's a trick. Sometimes it works.
DongWon, I'm curious, especially in science fiction and fantasy, do you ever get a query and you're just like, wow, that's really out there? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I mean, yes and no, right? Like, every now and again I'll read a story by a client or see an idea where, it's really trippy or it's really different and really unusual. And I think that can be really exciting if it's done well, right? I have this one client, Violet Allen, and she's written a couple short stories that are some of the weirdest, wildest things I've ever read, to the point that I'm not even sure I really understand physically what's happening on the page, but the prose is so engaging and exciting that it just pulls you through. So I think there are times in which that kind of surrealism and that kind of like really pushing the boundaries can really work. But that said, the farther out you go, the harder it is to pull that off, right? Because it's hard to retain that clarity. It's hard to communicate what's really happening physically in a scene, and sometimes it's really important, especially when you're looking at something that's 100,000 words, 150,000 words. It's a long time to hold someone's attention, so you got to make sure you're really engaging on the page. But I was thinking about William Gibson's The Peripheral, which is a book that I adored reading. I got to page 100 and I literally went, oh, that's what this book is about, right? Like, not even in a big thematic sense, just in a literal, like, I understand what is happening on the page now. And it took me, 100 pages to get there. And that's because that's someone who I adore his work. I really trusted it. And the prose was really interesting. And the imagery was really interesting. So I was willing to ride with it. And, so that can work, but it's really tough. And you have to be sort of very much at the top of your game to be able to pull that off. That said, I've seen really wonderful fiction that really pushes boundaries in really interesting ways. I remember Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice felt shocking when it landed. Now we look back on it, and some of the things about that book that were so surprising have become very much part of the lexicon. But I don't know; those things are always exciting to me.
So to follow up on that, I'm curious, and I want to sort of transition to talking about world building here for a bit. DongWon, how much of a world do you really need to understand before you can settle into the story, or do you just kind of go with it and trust the author?
One thing I think about a lot with world building is we have this idea that world building only applies to science fiction fantasy. And I think, Jen, you were touching on this a little bit earlier, but any novel is doing world building, right? Yeah. If the world you are building is a suburban community at the end of a cul-de-sac, you've built every single piece of that world for the readers. And the thing to remember is that world building isn't about material items. It's not about what do the walls look like. It's about what are the rules of this universe, right? What's important to the people who live in it? What's a transgression? What is a success? What is a failure, right? Those are the things you're trying to communicate. So world building for me always comes back to character, right? The only thing I will care about the world is how it affects the character and how it limits or empowers them in the space. This is a kind of ridiculous example, but one of the things I've seen that does this better than almost anything else, and it taught me a lot, is Steven Universe, right? Steven Universe is a show that starts very small and it ends up at this cosmic scale. every time they would layer in another component of the world, it was tied to conflict with the character, right? It was every single world building element that was introduced in terms of how the magic works, in terms of the war, in terms of all these different things, was always something that was really specific and really grounded in a conflict that a character was having or with another character. And I think that to me taught me a lot. I mean, children's media is great for this because it's very simple sometimes and it operates in isolation. So you're like, oh, that's how that gear works. And that one for me was really interesting examination of how to make sure that world building, which is really important in any fiction that you're doing, is always clarifying and elucidating and giving depth rather than distracting.
Mm-hmm. So following up on world building, Jen, and this question might be a little too yes or no, but when you're building a world, when you're writing a story, do you build the world and sort of fit the story into that world, or do you tell the story and then fit the world around it? Do you just sort of take it depending on the story?
My methodology, and not everybody does this the same, but mine is to tell the story and let the world build around it. I just find that to be, it helps to clarify what it is you need in that world, because not every single element, sometimes you can build something for the world and you never use it. I mean, I remember Lord of the Rings, the movie, they had special forks for the elves. And you never see them in the movie, but they helped to build an atmosphere for a sense of how they ate. And it was just there. It was something they built. And but it just helped. Maybe it helped the various actors to sort of get into character. And I sort of think about that with when I'm quote unquote world building. What's more important is the story. And if the thing is a distraction from the story, then why have it there? Then it's just sort of, but if it helps to build a story or build an image of what you're trying to create, then that's when you use an element in the world.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, how much do you pull from reality, Jen, whenever you're writing? Do you pull a lot from scratch, or do you sort of incorporate what you're seeing in the world around you?
There's a lot. I mean, there's some basic elements of physics that you really shouldn't, gravity works. I mean, and it depending on where you are, depending on how that works, you sort of do think about how things work in reality, because that's the touchstone of how we understand the world. So it's very difficult to have readers understand what you're talking about if you don't have a method of being able to compare so they can see what you're talking about. Like the color red is the color red. And maybe on this other planet it's reddish or some kind of other kind of color, but you need that touchstone to say, okay, looks like the color red or something like that. I mean, if you follow my meaning. So you do have to grab from reality a lot so that your readers can follow you. Because the idea is to communicate. Mm-hmm. And if you can't communicate, if your thing is so out there that nobody knows anything about what you're talking about, then you have a little trouble there.
DongWon, turning that around to you, how important is it to have that tether to reality? Do you have to see where it ties into the human reality, or can it be sort of out there, for lack of a better term?
The farther out there it gets, the more tactile it needs to feel, I think, right? Because, I think we are people, and I think, Jen, you said this so wonderfully earlier about tying those things back to our senses, right? And, those are the modes in which that we as humans interact with the world. So if you want to show us a world that's truly wild and different and, has a very broad sort of, or is very far afield, then I think you need to find ways to tie it back as much as possible to an experience that is understandable and relatable, right? So, I don't think that every story has to be, Earth standard humans and, in environments that we recognize. And, you can do things that, involve very different ideas and concepts. But I think once you start to lose sight of how we process things as people, you're going to lose a lot of readers because people just aren't going to be able to follow you down whatever road you're going down. So, as much, I do think our embodiment is really important. And I think it's really important to feel how characters are embodied in the fiction, even if they don't physically have the same bodies as us or are physically in bodies at all, right? But remember that's how we process things, and think about how to use those as metaphor rather than literal application.
And Jen, with science fiction and with dystopian as well, there's always that chance to, and most of them do this, to critique social issues going on in the world right now. How influential is science fiction in sort of guiding us away from futuristic societies that we don't want to see come to pass?
Well, right now, this is my opinion. I think right now we're in a transitionary stage of how we look at science fiction. I think that's why some of the numbers for science fiction hasn't been as high as it has been for fantasy for the last 10 or so years. I think we are really been doing a serious re-examination of, say, golden age type science fiction and the worlds that they were building, which we are now at the time for a lot of these stories. Actually, we have passed a lot of those periods, and not none, but a lot of the stuff just didn't happen. I mean, if you think of cyberpunk, when I was growing up, was the vision of the future and the whole idea of Skynet and all that other stuff and singularity and all that stuff. Well, guess what? We went right past cyberpunk type stuff. I mean, the internet is Skynet. I mean, it didn't take over the world. It didn't do any of that stuff. And so there's a real conversation, I think, that might be happening. This is my suspicion, happening for science fiction, and how it has been too divorced from the social impact of the technology. And I think as things like Black Lives Matter and all these sort of this real cultural shift that we're in, there is a technological component of it. Think about it. Black Lives Matter is a hashtag. It's part of the technology. It wouldn't have moved the same way had we not had the technology behind it. So really, when we're talking about the future, you really can't, unless you're psychic of some kind, you really can't predict the future. And yes, there is an element of warning to it, but then there's an element of inclusion, which a lot of past science fiction, the worlds that they predicted didn't predict me. I just didn't exist, but here I am. And so as we think about a future and as we think about our current status, it's important to sort of try to be a little bit more broad in thinking about where we're going. And not, I mean, Octavia Butler said it so well when she talked about the future, saying, well, a lot of times when you write about the future, you say, take what we have now and then say more of that, and take what we did, this has happened, and then more of that. And that's not quite how the future works. The future is full of surprises. It's future things that this pandemic was a surprise, right? You know, this is as dystopian as, you know, everybody has been writing about. And everybody forgot, oh my God, toilet paper. Nobody talked about the lack of toilet paper in any of these. And that was a big deal. And hand sanitizer and masks and different things. You're like, oh my God, we've been writing about dystopia and we missed all of this. So, and this was a big surprise, and we're still living in it. And how, I guess a lot of the things did warn us about this, but how to prepare for it, how to deal with it. I don't know if science fiction really did us a favor here to really understand, and also the social impact, because I don't think these big protest movements could have happened without the pandemic happening at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that's, I mean, like I said, you know, it's hard to be psychic, but it's also important to just be willing to see and see the invisible ones, the ones that you kind of forget. And then next thing you know, they're like the most important thing. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that helps.
It definitely did.
Well, you know, and I sometimes I like to push back on this idea that science fiction is predictive, right? Because science fiction is about our current moment. It really is. It's using a different lens to examine the questions that we're looking at. And, you know, you mentioned Butler, and the reason she's one of the greatest science fiction writers of all time was she was a master at taking the conditions of the world around her and rendering those through a lens that was useful in a lot of ways, right? Like there's restorative justice movements, you know, in Detroit and elsewhere who are using Butler as a model for how to think about the world and how to engage with the world. And it's so fascinating to see the ways in which, you know, those movements are moving forward and how they're using that work. And, I think the more we can remember that science fiction is about the present moment, always, the better worlds we can build with that and the better futures we can imagine using that. But it's like what Jen was saying about Afrofuturism. That stuff is rooted in the past. It always is. It's informed by where we come from, by the worlds we live in. And the failures of golden age science fiction are rooted in the failures of post-war America, right? And those attitudes, of course, they perpetuated into the fiction. And of course, we now look back on so much of that as frustrating and problematic because the world has moved on from that perspective. So the more you can write your experience, the more you can write the truths that you see in the world around you, the more I think you're going to create really enduring fiction that will help people in the future.
So before I turn over to audience questions, I have to get your recommendations for key science fiction fantasy books that aspiring sci-fi fantasy writers should be reading. I already see the exasperation, Jen. Just a title or two, and you can plug your own book here too. This is the time that DongWon, if you have a book that's coming out that you want to promote, this is the time to do it. So,
oh my God,
because this is stressing Jen out, I'm going to start with you, DongWon.
Well, for a key science fiction book that is doing all the things we're talking about, I think a very easy example is N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season. I think the Broken Earth trilogy is this book that does an extraordinary job of interrogating, class and privilege and power and race without ever being reductive about it, without ever, being an allegory, a metaphor for how, Blackness in America is handled. But instead, you finish that book and you look back on it and realize, like, oh, it is about those things. It's about intergenerational trauma. It's about all these things that are some of the most important issues that we're reckoning with now. And, if you want to see how to use the tools of science fiction and fantasy to interrogate the world around you, there are very few people who are doing it at Nora's level.
Oh my God.
Sorry, I stole the easy one.
Oh my God, there's so many people to talk about, and it's hard to read Ted Chiang, for God's sake.
Oh God, yes, please.
Yeah. I actually just because I'm just trying to get again by Margaret Atwood. That's just been on my mind. Ursula Le Guin, almost anything by Ursula Le Guin is worth picking up. Left Hand of Darkness, especially. I've got some current stuff that I have on my side table that I haven't opened yet. that I would say, yes, read this, but I haven't read it yet, so I don't know how to recommend it. Jeffrey Ford is always somebody great to read. He tends to be more, actually kind of goes the gamut of science fiction and fantasy, but he's one of my favorite writers.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, a lot of great stuff. There's a lot of, just read broad. That's my comment. I'm still connected. Ooh.
Yes.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, broken up. Okay, I'll speak fast. Read fiction as well. I find that I've actually been picking up a lot of nonfiction, nature writing, because I find that it helps me to write with world building.
Yeah.
Like when I'm reading Annie Dillard and stuff, and just think that she's describing another world, it becomes a science fiction book. So I don't know. I'll just throw that out. Too many to come up with. That, but I named you a few. So there you go.
Honestly, I feel so lucky to be working in science fiction and fantasy in this time. I think this is, basically the most exciting time for the genre that I've ever seen. And looking back on it, like, I think there's so much exciting shift in how we publish in this genre, what is published, who gets to have a voice, what stories we get to tell. And, there's so much incredible work out there. I would encourage you all just to read broadly, and like Jen was saying, and read outside the genre, but inside the genre, it's a wonderful time, in my opinion.
There's a lot out there. It really is.
So I want to pull from the audience now. I want to start with a question. This comes up a lot in these discussions, so I want to ask it to both of you. DongWon, we'll start with you. How can you avoid appropriation of others' cultures in science fiction and fantasy whilst using themes riffing off of fables from other cultures that are not your own?
So for the next 2 hours of this class,
That's how the answer normally goes.
yeah, I give a whole talk about decolonizing your fiction. I like to shift the way we talk about it away from, really reductive ideas of diversity or even of appropriation. And, the ideas of decolonization I think are really important. Is it focuses on the historical framework in which you're working, right? So where do these stories come from? Who do they belong to? What are the power lines between the perspective you're writing from and the perspective of the culture that you're working in versus where these stories come from? How do you elevate, honor, and respect a story that doesn't come from your culture? And you can't do that without being aware of, the way America relates to, its imperial subjects, right? The way the British Empire relates to its imperial subjects, or historical or not. And so you need to think about who took whose story, who took whose people, and who is trying to erase somebody's history. And, the greatest trick of colonization is to steal other people's stories and turn them into your own. To steal the stories of the people that you are subjugating and use those to enforce your own power and enforce your own societal structures. So make sure you're not tapping into that legacy. Make sure you're not repeating those historical crimes as you are writing your fiction. So, I know you were looking for a simpler answer here, but the real answer is do your reading and do the homework, right? Know where those stories come from, know who those people are. And, it's not just about getting a POC stamp of approval on your story that doesn't exist. It's about doing the work to make sure that you are truly honoring the perspectives of those people and centering them and elevating them and not exploiting them.
And may I add something?
Absolutely, yeah.
And also, when you're writing these stories, you need to ask yourself why. Are you doing it just because it's cool, or is it there's something you really have to say? And if you're saying these things, are you using stereotypical ideas, your idea of that culture versus what that culture really is? Because that's where anybody, regardless of race, can make those mistakes. And you can do that not just for various cultures, you can do it for various people. Stereotypes of how a certain person is, a certain personality type. If you're doing that to make a point, then go for it. Know what you're doing. Like DongWon says, do your research. Whether that's talking to somebody or reading the books or both, just do the work. Because when you don't do the work, that's when you run into trouble. That's when somebody of that type is going to come and knock on your door and say, why did you do this? So, it's not that you can't do it. I think anybody can. Hell, I've got gay men running around in my book, and I've never been a gay man in my life, but I have. I mean, so many friends, and so much time, and these were stories that I could actually grab from because I knew it. And if there was somebody I needed to ask a question, there it was. So, just do your work.
Thank you for condensing those answers. I know that's a huge topic, but thank you for making it as concise as you could. Next question, we'll start with Jen on this one. Do you feel that every story should analyze humanity or teach us something, or can good books be like Hollywood popcorn movies with little introspection and just a lot of fun?
Oh, I think either or. I mean, there really is. I mean, I always say when I've been teaching, you can write whatever you want. If you just want to write something that's just fun, go for it. There's nothing wrong with that. And if you want to write something deeper, there's nothing wrong with that. And then there's always people who do a little bit of both and have a little fun. You could do whatever you want, but it depends on how you. This is when you're starting to get into DongWon's situation, because now it's like, how do you sell it? If it's a short story, okay, maybe you don't need an agent to sell it. You're going to sell it yourself. And you have to start thinking about what market this particular type of story is going to go into if you're really trying to sell it. If if it's just for you, do whatever you want, but if it's going to be sold, now you have to start thinking about where and how and all that kind of stuff.
So Jen pretty much started asking my question for me, DongWon, but I was going to ask you next, what is one of those stories more marketable than the other? When you're selling a book, Does it have to have that lesson to it, or can it just be a romp through space?
Yeah, I'm unfortunately going to challenge the premise of the question, right? Because Hollywood blockbuster movies are about stuff, right? Like Terminator is about police violence and oppression, right? Like, or Terminator 2 is. And, you know, Avengers Endgame is about stuff. Each of those Marvel movies is about something. Black Panther is about something, right? And all of those movies are examining the human condition and are teaching us lessons about how people operate. How do we respond to tragedy? How do we respond to joy? How do we respond to violence and oppression? You know, so those things are inseparable. The question is, are you doing it in a tragic tone, in a deep examination tone, or are you doing it in the context of an adventure? And, you know, I think both of those have their pluses and minuses in terms of marketing, in terms of impact and all those things. But, you know, I would encourage you to not draw a distinct line between this book isn't about something, this book is about something. All books are about stuff, right? The question is, how do you engage with it, and what's the story you want to tell? It's always about story. It's always about the story you want to tell. Even if you're writing a book that is engaging with really heavy topics in really serious ways, it doesn't matter unless you're telling me a good story, right? Otherwise, like I said, go write an essay, right? If you want to be a fiction writer, write good fiction. And that's kind of it at the end of the day. I know that's a lot easier said than done, but, you know, I think that's the challenge.
Mm-hmm. So last audience question, DongWon, I'm going to ask you this one because we are running out of time. It just in general, what's the place of comedy and humor in science fiction and fantasy? Like they mentioned Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett being hard acts to follow, but is there still room for humor in the genre?
If you're going from a business perspective, humorous fantasy and science fiction is incredibly hard, as evidenced by, I doubt anyone can really name more than those two writers, right? There's Tom Holt, maybe one or two other people, but, you know, when you're talking about comedic FNSF, it really is like two guys, right? It's a tough category. It's tough to do well. That said, I think humor is important in every book. I think being funny in a dark scene is one of the best ways to show how dark that scene is, right? Humor is something that should be woven through your work in a way that I think is really important, which is sort of the flip side. If you're writing something that is trying to be funny, it gets very hard to understand the stakes of the story. Pratchett was really great at working in really broad, really important social commentary into the very humorous tone of his stories. I think that's why those work. And, you know, it's a very tough thing to do from a craft level. It's a very, very tough thing to do from a business level.
So I want to end with a question that I always ask at the very end, which is just, if you could, you've both given such good advice already, but if you could say one thing to an aspiring science fiction fantasy writer, one piece of advice, what would it be? Jen, we'll start with you.
Right. Just keep writing. Write like you mean it. And even when you think it's terrible, keep writing. That's really it. That's, at the end of the day, that's really it. Just keep writing.
Yeah.
That's
I would 100%. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's some of my favorite advice, but DongWon, you go ahead.
Oh, I mean, that's 100% accurate. And, you know, if I think that's what I would have said if I had gone first, you know, but to the corollary to that is read. Just keep reading, right? Read everything you can. Read in the genre, read outside the genre, read history, read, you know, Jen mentioned reading articles online, you know, read long form pieces, read humor, anything you can get your hands on, anything that strikes your interest. I mean, don't torture yourself and read something you find terminally boring, but, you know, don't limit yourself to just this category. If you only read FNSF, then you're just regurgitating stuff we've seen before, and that's not going to be exciting and interesting. The best writers I know read all kinds of stuff in every category. You know, science writing, as Jen mentioned, is great. Naturalists are so useful in terms of learning how to do world building and description and things like that. History, obviously, is hugely important. Social commentary, text, everything. Don't turn your nose up at a literary novel just because it doesn't have spaceships and aliens in it. There's beautiful writing. There's incredible tension. There's really exciting work happening all over the place. And you will do your writing more favors than almost anything else you can do just by reading more.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So this is the point where I say goodbye to Jen and DongWon. Thank you both so much for being here. You've been incredibly insightful.
Thank you
Thank you
for
so much.
having
This was a lot of
me.
fun.
Yeah,
All
this was
right.
a lot of fun.
All right. So for everyone that wants to take part in the Twitter pitch party, just a reminder, what we do at the Twitter pitch party is here we go, sharing the screen now. This is how to participate in the Twitter pitch party. You can have from now until Friday at midnight to pitch your science fiction or fantasy book. We'll go through, pick out the pitches, send them to DongWon, and he will give us feedback for them, which I will then send along to those who pitch them. So this can be found on our website as well on the Inside Writing page, but I want to go over some of the tips and tricks and stuff that you should do in order to maximize the effectiveness of your pitch. First off, you want to make sure you condense your book pitch into a single tweet. Multiple tweet pitches are not allowed. That said, if you have more than one book pitch, you may pitch them all. Just use separate tweets for each one. Come up with a good comparable title or two. For instance, Dear Edward meets Where the Crawdads Sings. You want to be able to compare your book to two titles that are in your genre or outside of your genre. It helps the agent get a better sense of what it is you're writing and where it fits. Another little tip, focus on what makes your book unique. Usually that's the protagonist and the main drive of the plot. You don't have to set the scene. You don't have to build it. You don't have to tell us what the whole story is about. Just give it enough so that it's interesting enough that the agent wants to see more, which segues into the fourth tip. End it with a hook, something enticing to leave the agent questioning what comes next. Make them want more. You don't have to give the whole story away. Lastly, make sure you include the hashtag PITGOTHAM. That's Pit Gotham. If you don't include that hashtag, I can't find it. And you don't have to tag us. You don't have to do any of that. You just got to hashtag Pit Gotham. And then over the weekend, I will search for just that hashtag, collect the pitches, send them to DongWon, and get you your feedback. So that's all we have today for science fiction and fantasy. As a reminder, this show is recorded. So if you missed any bit of it, we will be putting it up on YouTube and on the Inside Writing page within the next day or so. We also have all of our archived episodes there. We've had 6 or 7 episodes. I've lost track. But you can go watch any of them on our YouTube page. And until next time, next time is another show. Next Wednesday is nonfiction, general nonfiction, everything except memoir. So make sure that you go sign up there. The registration is open for that, as well as mystery and thriller, which is the following week. So thank you all so much for joining us, and I'll see you next week.